We're joined on the line by Mary Eberstadt. She is the author of a brand new book, Primal Screams, and also the article, The Fury of Fatherlessness, in which she explores how divisive unrest in America is really not about systemic racism, but about something very different. Mary, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
So let's talk about the fact that we now seem to be in an era of wild unrest. The last 7 months have seen a lot of street violence, ranging from Antifa to Black Lives Matter riots. And of course, there's a lot of worry about election unrest. And there's been a lot of talk in the media, of course, about how this is all the result of longstanding systemic racism, about how this is all the result of the deep inequity of all of the systems and institutions of the United States. In your book, Primal Screams, you talk about something else. You talk about the destruction of the family unit and the rise of the sexual revolution and identity politics. What exactly is causing all of this?
Well, first we got to put a few numbers to this, Ben. Over the last few months, there have been over 10,000 incidents of what's called unrest, protests. 500 of those turned into riots. And what we have to understand is these are not politics as usual. These are not the regular protests. These mobs not only tore down Confederate statues, they tore down statues of town fathers, of Mahatma Gandhi, of anything that looked like a paternal authority figure. They disrupted families out eating dinner. They woke up families in the middle of the night in residential neighborhoods, shining flashlights and shouting. So this is not what we usually think about when we think about legitimate protests. My thesis is that we are witnessing a social breakdown in which people who are increasingly disconnected from real families and real communities, like religious communities, are expressing resentment and fury at other people who have these things. And I think this is something new on the scene. 60 years of rising fatherlessness and declining religion and declining patriotism have left many people severely disconnected from the usual building blocks of identity. And I think that's what we've been seeing in the streets of America.
So to quantify this a little bit, if you look at Europe, obviously there are very high levels of secularism. If you look in Northern Europe, particularly, very high levels of single motherhood. We don't seem to see the same kind of street level violence, or do we? Is America unique in this respect, and if so, why?
I think we're more disconnected than they are because I think fatherlessness is more concentrated in the United States. And it's not as if we don't know this. We've been hearing for 60 years from sociologists that fatherlessness is a problem that leads to a lot of adverse outcomes. To name just one example, the gang problem in inner cities, it is well documented, is pretty much a daddy problem. Kids who come from intact homes, even if they live in bad neighborhoods, rarely join street gangs. So I think we're seeing, especially in our inner cities, that the United States has reached a point where we can't ignore this problem anymore, and we have to figure out ways of dealing with it.
We're speaking with Mary Eberstadt, the author of Primal Screams. So, Mary, one of the things that's been fascinating to watch over the past few years is a shift from a basic common ground acceptance that fathers were necessary in the home to a new argument, which is that even the social standard by which we expect fathers to be in the home is in and of itself systemic racism. This is an argument that's been made by Robin DiAngelo or Ibram Kendi. Their basic supposition is that any inequality is attributable in the end to systemic inequity. The system itself is corrupt, that even asking for there to be fathers in the home is just because the system was designed in a way by white people or by exploiters in order to require things that simply don't need to be. In an ideal system, you could have a variety of different types of family units. They would all work similarly, and that the inputs of family unit would not actually lead to particular outputs. What do you make of that argument, and why has it shifted?
Well, I think it's really sad, Ben. I think it's a kind of preemptive capitulation. It's a kind of giving up on the idea that anything can ever be better. And I don't think we should go down that road. I do think that we should have some empathy with the protesters out there, with all of these dispossessed, disconnected young people who literally don't know who they are because they've been deprived of the paternal principle, not only literally in the home, but also in communities like religious communities and other places where they could once attach and learn how to be productive members of society. So we need some empathy, but we also need to understand that they are not victims in the way that they think they're victims. They're victims of something else, which are the massive social changes that the United States has undergone since the sexual revolution.
We're speaking with Mary Eberstadt. Her book is Primal Screams. So what exactly did happen? Because if you look back to the early 20th century, the rates of marriage in the black community were actually higher than the rates of marriage in the white community. Even if you look back to the early 60s, only about 20% of kids who were born in black families were born into single-parent households. Now it is in excess of 70%. The idea from the left seems to be that racism actually got worse, that it went underground, it got worse, it got more subtle, and thus that rise in single motherhood can actually be blamed on racist substructures. But what is the reason why single motherhood has been rising, not just among black families, but among white families? Over 40% of white kids are born without a father in the home now.
Well, right. It's not just a black thing. I mean, short answer is that the birth control pill came along in the early 1960s, and most of humanity decided to have a big party over it and didn't understand that far from being a marriage strengthener, the embrace of the pill would lead to widespread family breakup, soaring rates of abortion eventually, and single-parent homes. Now, in fairness, this wasn't well understood in the beginning, but after 60 years of social science, we can see very clearly in retrospect that a lot of the fallout of the sexual revolution has been negative, and it's fallen hardest on the youngest and most vulnerable and most bereft. And that's what I'm trying to bring out in my writing, is that the consequences to the young have been particularly steep and need to be addressed. There's a lot of suffering out there because of this.
There's a certain bizarre paternalism, Mary, that exists, particularly in the media and Hollywood sphere, whereby the people who are the sort of elite in terms of earning capacity in our society, they tut these moral standards while still abiding by them. This is a point that Charles Murray has made in Coming Apart, is the basic idea that you have a lot of people who are at the top of the economic ladder who will say that family structure is not necessary, and then they'll proceed to engage in exactly the sort of family structure that is required as a prerequisite for success in life. Meanwhile, people who are worse off are taking that stuff seriously, and they're not forming family units, and thus passing down intergenerational poverty. What is motivating that, and how do we break the cycle?
Well, there is a lot of duplicity out there, as you point out. There's a lot of hypocrisy, and I think also the whole canard about racism is an attempt to evade the actual problem that we're facing out there. I mean, America's not a racist country. It's a beacon for immigrants of every color. Our churches, our military are very integrated. You know, the overwhelming majority of people are indifferent or enthusiastic about intermarriage. So I think the reason the racism argument has center stage is that it's easier to deal with. It's easier to virtue signal about than the actual problem, which is that we have people who can't fit into society because they haven't learned the basics of human identity. They haven't learned how to be a productive family member because they're coming from fractured families. They haven't learned how to behave in the public square because they don't have the example before them of church leaders, paternal leaders, showing them what to do. So we have to understand, Ben, that some of these problems are beyond politics and have to be worked at on the very grassroots kind of level in the churches and other houses of worship in particular.
So we're speaking with Mary Eberstadt. Her book is Primal Screams. In some of your previous writing, you've talked about the decline of religion in the United States. So which do you think came first, the decline of religion or the decline of the family unit? Because they seem to be pretty well intertwined. A lot of theorists and philosophers have suggested that the increased secularization of the West sort of set the soft groundwork for when the pill came into being. The sexual revolution, a lot of people have suggested the reverse, that it was the sexual revolution that undermined the capacity for religion to even hem it in. Which do you think is, which came first here, the chicken or the egg? Which sort of begs the second question, which is, how do we restore any semblance of family normalcy?
Yeah, the two things are impossible to separate, the decline of the family and the decline of organized religion. And it's a fascinating relationship because it looks like having some idea of an earthly father might help you to have some idea of a supernatural father, and vice versa. In other words, these things are related, and they're related historically, Ben. If you look at places with declining families, you find places with declining religion. Example, Scandinavia, which pioneered the single-parent home in the West, is also the place with the least organized religion in the entire Western world. So these things are clearly related at the root, and what that means is that you can't restore one without restoring the other. And so as a matter of politics, I think we are overdue for looking at grassroots efforts to make marriage easier and more lucrative, make child rearing and childbearing easier and more lucrative. We need a lot of grassroots experimentation, I think, but those are the first steps toward a restoration.
Mary Eberstadt, author of Primal Screams. Go pick up a copy of the book right now. Mary, really appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, Ben.